Welcome to a slide presentation about electoral reform. It is extremely unlikely that you will understand what follows. Not because it's difficult to understand, nor because you're necessarily stupid, although by definition at least half the population is below average intelligence. No, it's because you probably already think you know it all, especially if you've received enough education to pass for well-informed. Well-informed means you toe the line, do what those in power want. It means you've drunk the Kool-Aid. You don't see what is there but rather what you've been told is there. So it is even less likely that you will listen to someone who provides simple answers to simple questions using actual fact, let alone that you will grasp subtle realities in full view. My experience is that most of you will stop thinking about what I am saying and start talking over the TV or computer as soon as I say something you think you know about. Please, do at least try not to let your emotions run riot over fact, logic, and common sense. If you end up in a cognitive dissonance, it's because you started out with a false premise. Using a spoonerism of military jargon, electoral reform is already a fustercluck. There are enough headless chickens running about. You adding to the din won't help because the status quo depends on there being as much confusion as possible so that no change ever robs those in power of that power. The upside of this presentation for me is I don't have to listen to any of your inane objections. Not only am I dead by the time you listen to this, I've already heard them all, and refute them here with facts, law, and logic. You're either part of the solution or you are the problem. Okay, right. Now we understand each other. Please feel free to bugger off and let your country self-destruct. Let democracy fail. Enjoy the bloodshed. But for the rest of you, if any, please continue. What is democracy? History shows democracy happens because of a people's mindset. One that values consensus expressed through voice over charisma expressed through force. Expression of democratic mindset is through the democratic contract, which holds that the majority will rule with the consent of the minority, but not oppressively. Minority concerns must be heard, considered, and, where possible, accommodated. This is at the heart of Roberts and Nathan's rules of order for democratic legislatures. Democracy is not unique because of checks and balances, laws, justice, politics, elections, or democratic institutions. These are trappings of democracy, as well as of other types of government. A last stage in failure to agree, majority rule defines a limit of democracy, not its essence. Yet, not defining democracy leads to circular reasoning and pomposity, appropriately known by its acronym CRAP, or CRAP. CRAP began in earnest with Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson unjustly vilifying King George III in order to rally a rabble into doing that which they otherwise would not. The United States is not now, never has been, and was never intended to be democratic. It was designed to ensure rich white landowners remained firmly in control. But there would be elections, so the people could pretend they lived in a democracy. What was actually created has become known as agonarchy. An arena of combat for spectacle in which winning and losing are defined by an arbitrary rule. The arbitrary rule in Canada, the US, and the UK is the plurality rule, which defines the winner in a riding as the candidate with the most votes. Such a system is called single-member plurality, SMP. SMP begs the question, why should ridings be more important than citizens in a democracy? Agonarchy sufficed for all-powerful legislature with local input, but does not work for an all-powerful democratic citizenry defining the content of the legislature. To understand why the plurality rule is not democratic, we need to conceptually define democracy. In a staggering failure of nominative determinism, 70 years of political science argument, discussion, and publishing in furtherance of academic careers has left democracy undefined. How do you have a 70-year discussion about something undefined and still have the gall to call it science? The language of science is mathematics, not crap. Fortunately, the Supreme Court of Canada, SCC, has been assertive about the right to vote. From the so-called 1991 Carter case, we have, quote, the purpose of the right to vote enshrined in Section 3 of the Charter is not equality of voting power per se, but the right to effective representation. Ours is a representative democracy. Each citizen is entitled to be represented in government. Representation comprehends the idea of having a voice in the deliberations of government as well as the idea of the right to bring one's grievances and concerns to the attention of one's government representative. As noted in Dixon, 1989, elected representatives function in two roles: legislative and what has been termed the ombudsperson, role, end quote. Carter also ruled that the right to vote should be spoken of broadly, generously, and purposively, with due respect for the dignity of the individual citizen. Further, in Skopinker, 1984, the court ruled that in speaking of the right to vote, quote, the doctrine of the Constitution as a living tree mandates that narrow technical approaches are to be eschewed. End quote. 4 major Supreme Court decisions infer and confirm the common sense idea that representation should be by someone with whom the voter identifies. Democracy can thus be simply and purposively defined as a system of governance in which all exercisable voice or power is reserved to all citizens equally and independently. Representative democracy is then a democracy in which all voice or power is transferred fairly, faithfully, and openly to equal and independent representatives with whom the voters identify. Institutions recognized as democratic can arise in systems not democratic, which is one of many reasons why democracy can't be simply defined by its attributes. Voice is not free speech. Free speech is a feature of democracies, but no one has to listen to speech. Voice is the power to pass laws, which everyone must obey. All governments are defined by who has power, by who has voice. Voice is power and power is voice. Monarchy and other forms of dictatorship express the voice of one ruler. Oligarchies express the voice of a handful of lords, clerics, generals, or some other group of elites. Agonarchy provides voice for a substantial minority fraction of a country's citizens, while claiming to be democratic. In a democracy, voice is reserved to all citizens, equally and independently. It is not possible for a legislature to strongly speak with the voice of all he people if the voices of all the people are not represented in the legislature. Initially, the English Crown's voice enacted laws under absolute monarchy, with all power thought to originate from God. From the 9th to the 19th centuries, voice switched back and forth between Crown, House of Lords, and House of Commons. But since about 1900, all voice has been held by the House of Commons, now usually referred to simply as the House. The onset of democratic mindset was a fundamental change that happened over roughly the past century and a half in the West. Triggered by the advent of public education, cheap media, and easy travel at the end of the 19th century, but not acknowledged for its fundamental character by appropriate changes to the parliamentary electoral system. The subtlety, hidden in clear view, is this. Given that all voice rests with the people under democracy, democratic representatives are projecting the people's power to the legislature, not allocating legislative power to the people. This subtle change has not been acknowledged with appropriate electoral change in Canada, the US, or UK, despite claims of being democracies. The change may be subtle, but its absence is tearing the US apart, and threatens to do similarly for Canada and the UK. Power rests with the people, but the legislature possesses sole authority to exercise that power. The democratic legislature is the mechanics of turning the voices of the people into government. Of its own, the democratic house has no power, just authority, much as does the Crown. Why would an independent citizen entrust the exercise of their voice to a representative with whom that citizen disagrees? No independent citizen would. Each representative should be authorized to act in the legislature based on a quotient of citizens' voices sharing the same partisan persuasion. Where a quotient is the number of voters in an average riding, this is technically called proportional authorization, but will be called proportional representation, PR, which is a more common, if misleading, phraseology. Contrary to common assumption, PR can be achieved by changing very little in SMP systems. From definitions in case law, a ballot is a democratic vote, if and only if it authorizes use of the voter's voice in the deliberations of government by an equal and independent representative with whom the voter identifies. Transferring a maximum of citizens' voices demands PR, under which each political party gets the same proportion of voice authorization in the legislature as the power of citizens' voices polled at the ballot box. In reality, the number of ballots polled by a party is almost never an integer multiple of the quotient. This leads to one of several ways of assigning seats based on fractional quotients, largest remainder or plurality usually being used. In fact, the proven best way of democratically assigning seats is called the D'Hondt method, referenced in the end slides. An election is defined as choice by ballot of a person to fill the office of representing citizens to and in the legislature. The Supreme Court of Canada has established that MPs are there to discharge two representative offices: to provide legislative voice and to act as ombudsperson for constituents. Voice elects government, is non-local in character, secretive, and intensely partisan. Advocacy is inherently local, conducted face-to-face, open in conduct if reserved in content, and non-partisan. MPs will deny with intensity, bordering on pique, any suggestion that partisanship plays a role in their advocacy for constituents. The critical difference between these two offices is that voice is a constitutionally protected, preferred right, while advocacy is traditional. In designing an electoral system, voice expression must take precedence over all other considerations. Legislatures function on the bedrock democratic contract that the majority will rule with the consent of an unoppressed minority. Without the presence of the democratic contract in the mindset of the people, there can be tyranny by the majority instead of democracy. We will shortly see how to prevent tyranny by the majority in an unbiased way. 1500 years of English parliamentary government evolution, from the mid-5th century fall of Rome to the present, establishes accountable local representation as fundamental to the successful exercise of power by government. Governance derives strength and durability from fostering a bond between local and national interests through accountable local representation. Great power rests on great presence. As espoused in Carter, local representation or advocacy is one of the two roles for an elected representative, and is based on the idea of the right to bring one's grievances and concerns to the attention of one's government representative. Voice through secret ballot is inherently non-local, only being used periodically to establish the content of the House, i.e., to elect members of Parliament, MPs. Local representation or advocacy is ongoing, knowingly shared with the representative, and, most importantly, nonpartisan. MPs aver, with some asperity when challenged, that they represent all constituents equally. This is obviously only possible for advocacy, not for voice. Accountability requires, among other things, clear responsibility. By this argument, there should not be multiple representatives for a riding. Single-member ridings would then define the number of seats in the legislature. As we shall soon see, this is part of a much more important set of consequences of accountability. We need another set of ideas before turning to full discussion of democratic voice expression. That set of ideas is ballot split by type. Ballots universally split into winning or losing. Some of the winning ballots are essential while others are surplus to the win, what are known as ego ballots. Winning ballots are referred to as efficient, while losing and surplus as inefficient. Since they are for candidates who do not go on to sit in the legislature, losing ballots cannot express voice in the legislature. Surplus and essential ballots have the same purpose: to elect one representative. Equality of representatives infers that either essential and surplus ballots are suitably prorated in common value of voice, or surplus ballots have no voice. Voice should not be created out of thin air. For example, a representative who wins with 50% essential ballot count is not less powerful than one who wins with 50% essential plus 30% surplus. Either surplus and essential are each valued low and equal at representing voice, or essential provides all the voice, and surplus none. The two interpretations are equivalent, but the latter is easier to work with. Ballots are essential if changing one of them changes the outcome. Ideally, for representation to be accountable, all ballots must be essential. So, how does an SNP ballot perform at expressing democratic voice? Canadians cast an SNP ballot as shown. Each local candidate is listed with their party affiliation following in parentheses. Canada's publicly available data for 44 federal general elections shows that 30% of ballots are essential, 20% are surplus, and 50% are losing. So, 70% of ballots are voiceless and only 30% have voice. Half the voters, or 50%, get a candidate they voted for. The other 50% don't. The panel on the left is repeated here for comparison to two other important ways to look at ballot split by type. The easiest way to win an SNP election is not to convince voters your party is on the right track. It's to shore up the party base of voters and suppress the opposition's turnout. That makes what happens to non-voters important. because that group is effectively being gamed in a destructive fashion. As we see in the middle panel, only 21% of electors have voice in an SMP election. The right-hand panel shows that the 21% voiced electors splits 11% for government and 10% for opposition, the two parties that form a two-party system of government. The 1 percentage point separating government from opposition means government, and in particular long-term government policy, is unstable. Targeting that 1% separating government from opposition, using accurate polling and detailed, massive databases, is the source of agonarchy, and it all stems from the plurality rule's failure to reflect that power is coming from the voter and going to the legislature, not the other way around as before the advent of democracy. To achieve strong democracy, a slightly different ballot is best. The original SMP ballot is on the left, but can be filled in with 1 or 2 X's. On the right is a list of all parties running in a local collection of ridings, including the riding with these local candidates. The voter may make 2 X's in this column as well. This ballot preserves the SMP way of voting with a single X, for continuity's sake, but if a voter wants to have more nuance, it is available. A single X in the first column is counted as 2 ballots for the candidate and 2 for their party. Each X in the regional parties list takes precedence over parenthetical choice in the list of candidates. For instance, here the ballots would be counted 1 for Susie Q, 1 for Aki Kenosha, 1 for the Liberals, and 1 for the Greens. This easily counted ballot preserves the security of a paper system. Any greater number of choices would require automation. There is no parenthetical candidate associated with opting for a particular party. Leaving the candidates list empty means the voter doesn't like any local candidate. Voting for a party but not its local candidate is a judgment that should impact party choice of candidates in the next election. None of the above reflects mandatory balloting, allowing a protest vote that gives feedback to political parties. This 2-choice 4-option ballot provides voice to 95% of voters instead of SMP's 30%. 60% of voters have an MP they voted for as compared to 48% under SMP. As commented previously, proportional authorization is equivalent to proportional representation, PR, the latter being a more familiar term but misleading about who has power and who does not. Just remember that power is flowing from the voter to the legislature. It is not trying to somehow influence the makeup of the legislature. It is absolutely the makeup of the legislature. The legislature should be a snapshot of the electorate, not a pixelated blur of a sideways glance at the electorate. PR is necessary for maximum voice expression. Single-member districts are necessary for accountable local representation, and both are needed for strong governance. Therefore, democracy demands single-member district proportional representation, SMDPR. The final concept in the theory of democratic voice expression is allocation matching division structure, something absolutely critical for strong government. Achieving high accountable local representation with single-member districts requires separating voice from advocacy. Using the concepts of allocation and matching divisions, allocation divisions for voice and matching divisions for accountable local representation. As a note on proper usage, seats are allotted by constitution, tradition, or other mechanisms. They are allocated to parties and matched to candidates by electoral systems. An allocation division is usually a geographic district in which seats are allocated to parties. A matching division is usually a geographic district in which seats are matched to candidates. I am now going to deal only with Canada, but it doesn't take much imagine to transcribe to the US and UK. Here is a possible allocation matching division structure for Canada. This is the structure used to test SMDPR in the data supporting factual statements made in this presentation. However, no attempt was made to ensure subprovincial allocation division parity, which reduces voice expression by about 2% of all citizens. So, here we go. Now we have the tools to go through how to proportionally allocate seats to political parties and match candidates to allocated seats, while maintaining single-member districts and fostering strong government. We're going to build, step by step, a quite busy slide, with each step being simple. Don't let the busy overpower the simple. Go back and review if you get lost. Everything you need to know about proportional representation and the pros and cons of the arguments will be in the final slide of the set. Here we have one allocation division consisting of 10 matching divisions, called ridings in Canada, each represented by a colored circle labeled A to J, each enclosing 12 colored dots representing 12 ballots. These are very small ridings. Each color represents one of 4 parties, with black representing an elector who chose not to vote. The color of the circle is of the party that polled a plurality in the riding, with the lighter background shading making it easier to identify seats won by each party. There are a total of 120 electors, 20 of which did not vote, leaving 100 ballots cast. The quotient, or number of ballots needed to guarantee allocation of a seat, is 10 ballots per seat, because 100 ballots divided by 10 seats equals 10 ballots per seat. A simple count shows that 6 pluralities were won by the red party and 4 by blue, which are respectively 60 and 40% of the 10-seat total. Essential ballots are necessary for the win, which with the plurality rule is 1 more than the second highest count. 20 for red and 17 for blue for a total essential ballot count of 37. The Citizens' Voices table shows how many ballots were cast for each party, as well as each party's percent of the total. These are numerically equal here since the total is 100 ballots. To allocate seats proportionally, we now rewrite the ballot counts as multiples of the quotient, which is 10, as we already calculated. For example, the red party polled 42 ballots, which is 4 quotients of 10 each with 2 ballots left over as a residual. Similar calculations are done for each party. Each quotient allocates 1 seat to a party. Red had 4 quotients, so it is allocated 4 seats, and so on as highlighted by the tall rectangle around the quotient totals per party. Full quotients allocate 8 seats here, leaving 2 seats to be filled by residuals. As mentioned previously, perhaps the simplest assignment of residuals is by so-called highest remainder. In this case, blue and orange are tied at the highest residual of 9. Since there are 2 seats left to be filled, the tie does not matter. Each party gets 1 seat allocated. If there were a tie, it would be settled by a random number assigned secretly before the election. There are quite a few ways to settle remainders, with so-called D'Hondt method providing the highest number of essential ballots or voiced ballots, which makes it the most democratic. All 10 seats are now allocated. How should they be matched to candidates? An unbiased way to match candidates is by ranking them based on local candidate performance. Divide the ballots each candidate polled by the number of electors in their riding. Electors is used instead of total riding votes in order to eliminate turnout as a gameable variable, thus diminishing the value of opposition ballot suppression. In riding A, red polled 5 ballots out of 12 electors, yielding a fraction of 0.417. All other candidates' rankings are calculated in the same way. A list is made of rankings from highest to lowest, shown in 2 columns here because of space limits. Again, ties are settled using a random number. Seats are now matched to candidates based on A. Party allocation of seats, B. Highest ranking first, and C. 1 and only 1 representative per riding. The red party was allocated 4 seats and happens to have the highest ranking 4 candidates. Each of these candidates and their riding is therefore matched to red allocations. Here, in ridings F, I, B, and A in ranked order. The blue party is allocated 3 seats and its highest ranking 3 candidates are in ridings J, E, and C, each of which riding is not already matched. So these 3 ridings match the blue allocation of seats. The orange party is allocated 2 seats, but its highest ranked candidates are in E and I, which are already taken by red and blue respectively, and by rankings that beat out orange in both cases. The 2 orange seats must then be matched to D and H, the orange party's next highest candidates and ridings not already matched. Had orange gone first, it would have matched I and J, but these candidates would have then been beaten by the red and blue party candidates in I and J, leaving orange with D and H again. It doesn't matter which party goes first. That leaves riding G, for the Green Party to fill its 1-seat allocation with its highest-ranking candidate in a seat not already won more handily by another candidate. Each party has a candidate filling its seat allocation and there are no clashes. Each riding has 1 and only 1 local candidate. The matched candidates are now declared elected, indicated here with an appropriately colored star placed before the winning candidates. Citizens' voice expression and essential ballots are again calculated as shown. Note that voice expression is very much closer to proportion of ballots polled than under SMP rules. Note also that only Red's 2 residual ballots were inefficient. For a 98% efficiency of voice expression, we have, step by step, built a complete explanation of how to proportionally allocate single-member ridings to parties. With democracy as the goal and d'Hondt as the only acceptable way to allocate remainders, this is the only single-member district proportional allocation method. Matching can be done in probably innumerable ways. I have chosen the only unbiased method I could think of, but I did play around with adding past candidate performance, party preferences, etc. They all seemed biased and therefore less democratic. This result then is a unique single-member district proportional representation system. There are pros and cons to this system, just as there are to any other. The pros crush the cons in this case, however, to a consideration of which we now turn. The central issue of electoral reform is voice expression versus winning pluralities. It is not possible to have both. Will Canada, the US, and UK be democracies and get rid of SMP or not? There are strong arguments for getting rid of it. Having already used the idea of a quotient, I define the natural quotient as the number of ballots needed to guarantee allocation of a seat in an allocation division. The natural threshold is the percent of the total allocation division ballot count needed to guarantee allocation of a seat in an allocation division. For example, with 2,000 ballots in a 10-matching division allocation division, the quotient is 2,000 ballots for 10 seats or 200 ballots per seat. The threshold is then 200 ballots out of 2,000 ballots or 10%. The same natural quotient for 1,000 ballots in a 5-matching division allocation division yields a natural threshold of 20%. The number of parties seated in an election is roughly controlled by the total number of matching divisions in the nation and the natural threshold, which is set by the number of matching divisions in an allocation division. Higher natural thresholds mean fewer matching divisions in an allocation division and therefore fewer seated parties. The reverse being true for lower thresholds. There cannot be more parties than the number of seats available nationally, which is a very weak control on political party formation. The natural threshold, or equivalently the number of matching divisions in an allocation division, more powerfully controls the number of political parties and thus the strength of government. It is essential to realize that controlling the number of political parties in no way limits democratic voice expression. Think of political parties as variations of opinion on a given issue of national importance. Controlling the number of political parties then focuses the national discussion, but in no way excludes any citizen from participating. Since the natural threshold is the reciprocal of the number of matching divisions in an allocation division, and SMP has only one matching division in each allocation division, the natural threshold for SMP is 100%. Certainly, if a party polls 100% of the ballots in a riding, it will be guaranteed allocation of the seat. If not, then, under SMP plurality rules, the highest remainder wins. The actual threshold remains the percent of ballots needed to win, which is inversely proportional to the number of political parties running candidates in the riding. The actual minimum threshold under SMP is as shown on the right for different numbers of parties running candidates. Clearly, the number of seats in the country is the only upper bound on party formation under SMP. Returning to the mechanics of SMDPR, here is an allocation division similar to the one used previously, but with a few ballots changed. Allocation is the same, but the Green Party must match riding B here, in which it ran no candidate. The seat can be allocated to the next highest remainder, which is the Red Party here, or it could be allocated to the plurality winner, which is again the Red Party here. Alternatively, the Green ballots can be excluded and all rankings recalculated, yielding a new allocation. There are lots of ways to recover. The important point, though, is that a party can't know beforehand which seats it will definitely match. Matching an allocated seat thus requires a party to run candidates in all matching divisions, a considerable barrier to small parties and independents. This mechanism is justified because national questions deserve to be addressed by parties with serious national presence. Minorities should never have majority power. On the other hand, the democratic contract requires that majority power should never be oppressive. Minorities must be heard, considered, and, where possible, accommodated. Another takeaway from this example is how well the overall result is balanced under SMDPR. Most seats are predictable from local plurality/majority, but almost all ballots are essential. Changing a handful of ballots can change the result in detail. Sometimes not even polling a local majority is enough under SMDPR. For example, the Liberals polled about 63% of the ballots in Nova Scotia's 2015 results. 10 majorities and 1 plurality. Under SMDPR, the plurality win and 3 of the majority wins would have lost on proportional allocation, as befitting voice representation of almost 40% of the voters. That election was an example of the dangers of regionalization under SMP. Parity is not an issue within an SMDPR allocation division. Every ballot counts equally no matter how big or small the riding. This means visible minorities can be represented by one of their own by creating a riding that is largely populated by the minority. Each party will be forced to choose a candidate from the minority, one of which will win. There must be at least one quotient of visible minority electors in the allocation division before this action can be justified. Obviously, this decision has to be nonpartisan. Allocation divisions of size 10 ridings have a threshold of 10%. Any party that is able to poll 10% of the total ballots in the allocation division will be guaranteed allocation of a seat. This makes it very hard for a major national party to be shut out of an allocation division. Even if a full quotient is not polled by a national party, they are almost certainly going to have the highest remainder, which will give them a partial quotient seat. Larger allocation divisions encourage new parties to form, perhaps appropriately as there are more diverse views in a larger group of people. Smaller allocation divisions make it difficult for parties to survive, weeding out parties with weak support. Gridlock can be broken either by increasing or decreasing the number of parties through a change in threshold. If there are already a lot of parties, raising the threshold might be the way to break gridlock. If there are only 2 major blocks, or even only 2 parties, then increasing the number of parties will determine which bloc is best able to manage democratic negotiations. Tyranny of the majority can be dealt with by reducing the threshold. Simply increase the number of matching division in an allocation division. There will then be more parties, breaking tyranny. Regionalization, representation of visible minorities by one of their own, tyranny of the majority, and many other situations can obviously be addressed by manipulation of allocation matching division structure. This must obviously be done by a nonpartisan body charged with proceeding constitutionally and in the best interests of strong government. Allocation matching division structure allows control of thresholds, and thus the number of seated parties. As shown, once the population rises by 1 quotient, a new matching division can be added. As the population grows, more matching divisions are added until it makes sense to add a new allocation division. The effect of this change is to lower the threshold, encouraging new parties, as is perhaps appropriate to new immigrants or just a young population coming of franchise age. Once a new allocation division is added, the original division can go back to its original size, raising the threshold and placing new parties under stress. Those that are favored by the voters will survive, adding vibrancy to politics. The same system, with nonpartisan goals decided, can sustain population changes while keeping the number of political parties relatively stable, and thus promote strong government. The importance of this feature bears reiteration. This manipulation of allocation matching division structure serves to focus the voice of the people around whatever issues are of current national importance. It does not limit democratic voice on those issues. If a point of view not represented forms quickly, a new political party espousing that view can appear and gain power immediately. So, there are many reasons to insist on SMDPR. Solid, constitutional reasons. Its main detraction is one of cognitive dissonance. To wit, losing pluralities. Cognitive dissonance because democracy is not possible without voice expression, and the plurality rule severely compromises voice expression. They can't exist together. SMP is the only system in which the plurality always decides how representatives are elected. Every other system ignores pluralities in one way or another. SMDPR ignores pluralities only when voice expression would suffer. This amounts to about 18% of ridings usually. Mixed member proportional representation, MMPR, as proposed by the Law Commission, 2004, would ignore 33% of pluralities, while single transferable vote, STV, in Ireland ignored 37% of pluralities in 2016. Nonetheless, losing pluralities under SMDPR means, occasionally, a candidate with 5 or 10% of the local vote will win. This typically only happens in a riding with low turnout and badly divided partisan voice expression, and it happens because the citizens that voted for that voice expression deserve a seat. In addition, every major voice expression in the riding will have a representative voice to call their own elsewhere in the allocation division. Since voice expression has nothing to do with it, advocacy doesn't change under SMDPR. Except that someone winning with 5% of the ballot count is going to bust a gut to deserve more votes next time. In terms of numbers, SMP provides 48% of voters with a local candidate with whom they share voice expression. That number is 60% under SMDPR. Despite the odd, perhaps weird-seeming, plurality loss, SMDPR actually gives voters their popular choice more often than does SMP. Sweden also uses losing pluralities and has done so without major complaint. It seems unfair to ascribe greater natural sense to Swedes than to Canadians. SMDPR with only one matching division in an allocation division, and with largest remainder as the rule for deciding fractional quotients of ballots, is SMP. Ridings are structurally and functionally unchanged. There is one and only one representative per riding, and there are no other types of representatives, possibly creating hierarchies. The SMP way of filling in a ballot remains. The only thing that changes is how the ballots are counted, and that has to change no matter what new system is adopted. With 338 ridings grouped into 33 allocation divisions, as suggested for allocation/matching division structure previously, SMDPR amounts to 33 implementations of the Swedish system, but with single rather than multiple member representation per riding. In other words, SMDPR has a fine track record, and is not such a novel experiment as might be initially imagined. Citizens just have to get over the fact that pluralities always winning is why government fails to give the voters what they wanted. It also puts the country at peril of insurrection, as we're witnessing in the US today. Now, let's see what the numbers have to say. Voice is easily measured, making comparison of electoral systems possible in quantitative rather than qualitative terms. Other than the three measures being presented here, there are no measures of democracy described in the canonical political science literature, largely because political science has failed to define democracy. Counting the number of essential ballots only allows comparison of electoral systems based on voice expression impeded only by ballot inefficiency. Ballots split by type can be presented as a stacked column for each country, with losing ballots at the base of each column, followed, going up, by surplus and with essential at the top. Clearly, party list proportional systems, whether national or local lists, provide the most voice for voters. See SMDPR, Sweden, and Israel, although MMPR is a close second. The columns for SMDPR in Israel and Canada use data from current elections, in which balloting is affected by current proportionality expectations and thresholds. Israel should have a 95% essential ballot count with an actual SMDPR implementation, the same as Canada and Sweden. Ballot split by type data can also be presented over time as shown for Canada's 44 general elections since 1867. Essential ballots have declined as a percentage of electors during the 20th century, while surplus and losing ballots have varied less. Note the slight reversal in trend of essential ballots toward the end of the 20th century. There are no doubt many facets to be explored here, but there is reason to focus on the latter quarter of the 20th century up to the present. During the 1925 to 80 period, overall ballots gradually decreased for government and increased for opposition. This correlates with the electorate becoming less cohesive and more metropolitan over the Depression, war years, and with the impact of the Great Society. Note that government has seldom polled more ballots than opposition. After 1980, there is again a suggestion of something else happening. To better see this, we therefore look at ballot split types for government/opposition individually. Essential ballots indeed show evidence of accelerated change in the latter 20 years or so of the 20th century, followed by an actual reversal of trendline positions in the early 21st century. Surplus ballot trend lines also converge and cross toward the end of the 20th century and into the 21st. Losing ballot trend lines are fairly stable throughout the post-World War I period. Together, these charts show SMP provides majority rule by minorities, and that the 1980s and 90s mark an accelerated departure from democracy toward agonarchy, in which the easiest way to win is to maintain the base and suppress opposition turnout. The expected outstanding characteristic of suppressing opposition turnout would naturally be depressed overall turnout, which finding is confirmed from the 1980s on. These findings show Canada's democratic deficit is correlated with changes in the behavior of political parties gaming of the plurality rule. But there are 5 impediments to voice expression: disenfranchisement, non-participation, malapportionment, politicization, and inefficiency. Ballot split by type measures the expression of voice through ballots, i.e., voice per ballot. Legislative Empowerment Measure, LEM, tallies the expression of voice per citizen, accounting for all 5 impediments. Details of the mathematics involved can be found in references at the end. Accountable Local Representation Measure is based on LEM, so is also a measure of voice expression, but focused on local representation. The output of legislative empowerment is shown here for Canada 2015. Read from the bottom of the column up. 27% of citizens were not allowed to vote, principally because of age restriction. 23% of citizens who were allowed to vote chose not to, the most common reason being lack of interest. The equivalent of 4% of citizens were disenfranchised as a result of ridings not all being the same size. The equivalent of 3% of citizens were disenfranchised as a result of mismatches between political representation and riding, including the effect of safe and sacrificial ridings. 29% of citizens cast an inefficient ballot. 12% of citizens cast an efficient ballot, which is therefore the value of LEM. As we shall see, the U.S. House also has an LEM of 12, but the U.S. system includes a 2/3 presidential veto, which means only 4% of U.S. citizens have an impeded voice. Since accountable is the obverse of essential, accountable local representation is legislative empowerment measure per average number of local representatives. With an LEM of 12 and SMP single member representation, ALRM, is also 12. SMDPR data is here again taken from a system in which voters had no anticipation of a proportional result. Both Israel and Canada should have an LEM of voice expression in the mid-50s% per citizen. Again, it is obvious that list proportional systems provide the greatest voice expression, mostly through efficient ballots and better turnout. What might otherwise be qualitatively suspected is quantitatively proven using an objective, universal measure, not an index. SMDPR accountable local representation measure values should be in the mid-50s, but even without that, SMDPR dominates all other systems. The reason why SMDPR's LEM is so close to Sweden is because it is the Swedish system altered for Canadian Federation and need for accountable local representation. SMDPR is therefore tried and reliable. In addition, SMDPR is SMP in a single allocation division that is also a matching division, so it is familiar except for losing pluralities. The next 3 slides summarize benefits of SMDPR. Without changing how SMP functions, SMDPR voice expression and accountable local representation are better than any other system in major world use. The most popular candidate in a riding wins 82% of the time, better than STV and MMPR, the usual system suggested for Canada. Voters get the candidate they voted for 60% of the time under SMDPR rather than 48% under SMP. Visible minorities can have representation by one of their own. Regionalization is virtually impossible. Separatist parties and independents are disfavored more than under SMP. Population changes have controlled effect on numbers of political parties, resulting in stability with growth. Management of allocation/matching division structure by an independent non-partisan commission acting on constitutional and other grounds allows solution of problems of tyranny of the majority, gridlock, and regionalization among other benefits. SMDPR is positively reinforced by many or youth voting. Passive parliamentary assemblies also fit well with SMDPR. These make available to government and everyone else a large, and accurate, and standing poll of public opinion. Both of these future improvements to democracy can be explored in Democratic Voice, a brief. Resistance to electoral reform is surely the most singular and complete example of CRAP or crap we have in the West. Pompous politicians declare SMP is essential for strong government. It has been so successful. Why should we change? The simple answer is, of course, because SMP gives us the likes of you, who don't represent us. We don't need stronger government by smaller minorities. Inevitably, a minority that wants to get rid of democracy takes control, and democracy is under threat. Facts become a matter of preference. People are oppressed, religions are banned, books are burned, freedom is curtailed, voice is silenced, and then speech is gone. This end stage is playing out in the US today. Far-right thinking and voice has been oppressed since at least 1860. Just to be clear, I would have been wearing blue in 1860 and opposing the despicable ideas emanating out of the South, dividing the nation. Just as today the far right in the US makes me want to vomit. But defeating domestic enemies of the nation is only necessary if the voices rebelling have not been fairly represented in the legislature. The US has grown large enough in an age of instant communication that it cannot sustain its so-called democracy without fairly representing all voices in the legislature. The oppressed factions are large enough to organize against a government that doesn't respect their views, no matter how despicable those views may be perceived to be. The US represents 12% of their citizens in the House of Representatives, but presidential veto means only 4% of citizens have unobstructed voice enacting law. Almost everyone's ballot doesn't matter. Casting a ballot has little more effect than watching a ball game. Add to that a 2-year term in which the prime occupation of the representative is to raise money for re-election, and you have agonarchy on steroids. Then, just to make sure people feel important but remain powerless, the US represents the voice of the people in 3 different ways, which neatly confuses responsibility for everything and ensures the ruling minority is the real voice. The third arm of the US system may save the country from Trump, but they can't save the country from SMP elections. What is needed in the US, UK, and Canada is actual democracy, which as we have seen leads ineluctably to SMDPR. With SMDPR there is little to gain. No packing and cracking, no leveraging a win by getting certain people to stay home on election day, no benefit for fake news. Fooling all of the people becomes impossible. Fooling some of the people becomes almost impossible. The power would be with the people and exercised by the legislature, not with a minority of rich white men bamboozling the people using a powerless legislature. Crap tells us that politicians will not introduce a change away from what greases their skids. What is needed in Canada, the US, and UK for democracy to survive is an independent Electoral Reform Commission, empowered to set, monitor, and adjust the electoral system in accordance with constitutional and jurisprudence principles, and with input from both political parties and ordinary people. As we have seen, such a body would be able to address most of the electoral problems facing any SMP country. SMP is the problem, not the solution. The US system is often portrayed as needing 2 strong national parties that dominate. This is bollocks of the highest caliber. The basis of legislative structure is 2 parties, but they are not political parties. There is a party for and one against each piece of legislation. That structure has nothing to do with political parties. Any one or group of political parties can form either the for or against party. Parliamentary government calls these structural parties government and opposition, purposively capitalized. It doesn't matter how many political parties there are. Any number of parties can lead to gridlock. Any number more than one can lead to tyranny of the majority. Any number more than one can lead to regionalization. All such situations should be addressed by an independent body, possessing authority to adjust allocation/division structure appropriately, but in an unbiased manner that benefits democracy and strong governance. In fact, there are strong numeric reasons to have at least 3 fairly equally well-supported political parties, since that way the majority cannot tyrannize, and legislation will better reflect a consensus. Conceptually defining democracy based on voice expression leads to SMDPR as the only democratic electoral system. It also provided the measures necessary to lay bare the disease rotting away democracy in Canada, the US, and UK. I'm done. Not one of the many politicians, academicians, electoral reform geeks, and everyday citizens that I have consulted has poked a serious hole in the data or logic used for this presentation. But I have no doubt political parties will find a way to game anything in their own interests. Therefore, my most important recommendation is for each of Canada, the US, and UK to establish an ERC that will set, monitor, and correct an SMDP or electoral system implementation.